I want to take this opportunity at the end of the Northern European Renaissance, now that we've seen Northern Europe as well as Italy, to compare the two so that you can see those differences side by side. And I want to look at a number of different elements, starting with specialty. In Northern Europe, we tend to see intense realism, like we do from the Patron and St. Stephen in the Melun Diptych. You can tell that these are realistic depictions. They're not idealizing the form in any way. Whereas in Italy, they tend to idealize the form. For example, the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici, who is in fact a pope, but being depicted by Michelangelo as a warrior, as a general, trying to capture his character and idealize his form. To the Italians, the form and realism is unimportant. After all, you don't remember what someone looks like, especially before the age of the camera. In Northern Europe, they want to focus on the image of the person. What do they actually look like? In terms of style, we tend to see simplified forms and measured proportions in Italy. So we see this young woman's portrait by Leonardo, and it's been simplified. There's no real background. The figure itself is simplified. He's not capturing the details of the skin and a lot of local color. He's capturing the overall shape. Whereas when we're looking at Northern Europe and the man in the red turban, what we see is lifelike features with a certain unflattering honesty. You could imagine that if this man suffered from a skin condition, we would probably see it in the painting. As it is, Van Eyck here has used a lot of local color to give us a sense of exactly what this person would have looked like. Whereas in Italy, it's more of an Instagram model. That's really what we're looking at, sort of an idealized form versus a realistic form. In terms of subject, in Italy, we tend to see religious and mythological scenes, as we see with Galatea by Raphael and The Last Supper by Leonardo. Whereas in Northern Europe, we tend to see scenes that are looking at religious and domestic themes, and they frequently mix. So we see religious images in domestic settings. We see a lot more humble images. That's what I'm looking for. So we don't have the grandiosity of Italy. These are images that would relate to people simply because they're things they would see, such as a butcher's stall by Erzen. When he ties in the religion, he's drawing you into something you already know. He's making it more relatable. Whereas The Last Supper, unless you happen to be a monk that's a member of that monastery, it's not nearly as relatable for the average viewer. When you look at figures, the Italians tend to have these heroic male nudes. And I'm focusing on male nudes. There were more male nudes in the Renaissance in Italy than you see female nudes. And they're looking at these massive heroic figures, usually focusing on anatomy. Whereas in Northern Europe, we tend to see prosperous citizens depicted in all of their fineries, such as the image of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife. They're showing off their status, whereas in Italy, they're showing stature. But in Italy, we're not seeing the middle class being depicted that much, whereas in Northern Europe, we see it all the time. And that's the difference. If I'm looking at a biblical figure, he's going or she is going to be bigger than life. They have to be grand and idealized. Whereas a middle class average person, someone that I can shake hands with and talk to, they need to be depicted in a very realistic way. They still need that sense of status, though, that sense of, well, almost heroism. So you're going to depict them with finery, with texture, with fine robes in a well-appointed room, as is our example here. In terms of portraits, we see the difference between Northern Europe and Italy. And I've been harping on this a couple of times throughout 16th century Northern Europe. In Italy, we tend to see simplified forms, reserved forms, very formal images, usually with a background or something to draw us past the image. The artist is trying to create sort of a complete composition, as we see with the Mona Lisa, but she is simplified in a lot of ways. For example, there's no local color. There's no sense of red to the cheeks, for example. Instead, Leonardo is capturing the shape as if he's capturing a sculpture. Whereas in Northern Europe with Teirlinck, we see something that is more realistic. He's not trying to idealize who she is. She's not trying to change who she is. She's trying to capture, in this case, Elizabeth I as princess. And we see a lot more realism there. We also see a lot more symbolism. The prayer book, the blank book in the background, or that ambiguous background, as well as the finery that tell us her station and who she is. This is an attempt to reveal individual personality through symbolism, something we don't generally see in Italy, which is why we look at the Mona Lisa and we say she's got that very enigmatic smile, because we can't tell anything about her. We don't even know if that's really what she looked like. In terms of technique, we tend to see fresco, tempera, and some oil painting in Italy. And in this case, the example I'm giving you is from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. This is a fresco. Whereas in Northern Europe, we almost always see oil. And oil paints allow for a lot of detail. You, of course, can go in and rework an area over and over again. The paint won't dry for days, weeks, or in some cases, months. Whereas in Italy, they're using primarily tempera and fresco, two techniques that require speed and accuracy. Michelangelo, when he creates this image, only has 3 to 6 hours to create the figure. Anything beyond that, he has to cut away the plaster and replaster and restart, leaving lines in between called giornales, or revealing the giornales, the day's work. So we see vast differences. In Italy, they're going to focus on, for example, the human figure. They're going to focus on form, because that's what you can do with temperas that dry in 20 minutes or frescoes that dry in a few hours. Whereas in Northern Europe, by using oils, I can suddenly start dealing with finer details, textures, such as the fur-lined robe that Albrecht Dürer is wearing there, or his hair, or his facial hair. I can put a lot more detail into that piece simply based on the media or technique that I'm using. Finally, we have emphasis. Now, in Italy, the emphasis is always on anatomical structure. So in other words, you need to have a figure that is anatomically correct, and then you would put clothing over it. And you always have that sense of the figure under the clothing, or the anatomical correctness of a nude figure like we see in Donatello's David. But it's always on that human form and the perfect proportions of the human form, proportions that can change slightly depending on the artist, but proportions nonetheless. Whereas in Northern Europe, you're focusing on visible appearance. So you end up with this assumption of Mary being depicted as if Mary has no body underneath all of that clothing. It's as if her head and hands exist in a mountain of cloth. And so we get that outward appearance, but that's where we get that strange appearance where it's almost like the stick figure you drew in first grade with the t-shirt around it. The t-shirt has no relation to the body underneath of the stick figure, and that's what we see in this assumption in other Northern European pieces. They're focusing on the clothing, not on the figure. Now, these are just some of the differences. There's a lot of other differences that are going to take place between Italy and Northern Europe in the Renaissance. But I wanted to come in and focus on some of these to give you that comparison.